Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my April wrap-up. So I wanted to be filming this wrap-up a little bit earlier in the month, but it just has not happened. So we're just going to go with it, and we're just going to talk about the books that I finished in April. I will not be talking about BookTube prize books, obviously. I can't talk about them until the end of May. And I won't be talking about my Book Naturalist Book Club read for April because I already filmed a separate review for that. So let's talk about what else I got up to. The first part of April, I was on vacation and I very exclusively read genre fiction. I was really into escapist reading during my vacation. So we're just going to go through that stuff quickly because it is probably the stuff that you're least interested in, and also because some of them I have not that much to say. But the first thing, I do have some things to say because I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, who needs no introduction. I mean, she is very popular amongst the TikTok bookish community type places. She is known for this series, which is romantasy, I believe is the term that's used. So basically a combination of romance and fantasy. Although I will say this first book in this series, this is the Court of Thorns and Roses series, and this is the first book, was much more of a fantasy book than it was a romance book. So in this story, our main character is Fairer, I believe is how you pronounce it. And she is a human in this world where her world has been separated from the world of the Fae, so a magical world. And her world is very poor. They are very scared that the Fae are going to come, like, do stuff to them, kill them, whatever, take them away to fairyland. And Fairer has been sort of promoted without her really wanting to be the sole provider for her family. Her mom, I believe, passed away, and so she lives with her dad and her two sisters, and she is the only person that is capable of going hunting and providing for the family. She goes hunting, and she kills game and then sells that for money to support the family. The two sisters are not helpful in this regard. The father is completely useless. And one day when she's out in the forest, she kills what she believes is a wolf, I think. She kills a wolf. And turns out the wolf is not really what he seems. So she has shot and killed a shapeshifter, basically a member of the Fae who was in his wolf form in the human world. And now she has to be taken to the world of the fairies or the world of the Fae, I should say. And she doesn't know what's going to happen to her at that point. She just knows that, like, because of some ancient agreement, she has to go to serve in that land for her sins. And so this is the story of what happens to her after she goes to that place. And the person that she has to serve is called Tamlin. He's a Fae with lots of powers, and she learns from being at his house. These are not words I'm just using plain words, but it's very elaborate. His estate, and the creatures that she meets there, and what she learns about what's going on really in the Fae community. And it all accumulates in her. She and Tamlin fall in love, and she has to go try to rescue him when he gets taken hostage. So yeah, that is basically the story in a nutshell. I'm not going to give anything more away. It is very compulsively readable. It is also not high literature. It's just a fun time. And that's exactly what I was looking for when I started my vacation, was a fun time. So I picked this book up in the airport and read it immediately upon starting my vacation. So did exactly what I wanted to do. I have since, just in the last couple days, started book 2 in this series. And yeah, so obviously I liked it well enough to continue on, and I do think they're a fun time. And if you're looking for escapist fiction, this is a great place to go. I then read a bunch of ebooks, and so I'm going to try to go through them fairly quickly. The first one was The Roommate Risk by Talia Hibbert. This is a romance book, and it is about jazz and her best friend Raul, and Jazz has to move into Raul's apartment because her apartment experiences a plumbing disaster and her bedroom gets ruined and has to be remodeled. This is a problem because even though they're best friends, Raul is very sexually attractive to Jazz, and Jazz is sort of not interested in long-term relationships. And so they have decided to not ruin the friendship by getting into the sex thing. But you know what's going to happen, right? So I like Talia Hibbert. I read some of her other books. I like her style. They're very sexy times, and they're very inclusive, and the men act really great and in some ways unrealistically towards the females in the book. But this was not my favorite book by Talia Hibbert, and it's ultimately pretty forgettable, although I had a good time while I was reading it. And again, I think it's a book that's really great for vacation consumption. I then read another romance, The Friend Zone by Abby Jimenez, who I have been really enjoying reading her stuff, and there'll be another book by her later on in the video, but this one did not work for me nearly as well as her other stuff. I think this one was like, it was doing way too much. It was taking on way too much. So it is the story of Kristen and Josh, who are, they get thrown together because they are both in a friend's, they are each part of a wedding party. So like one on the guy's side and one on the girl's side. And so they're thrown together. Because of that, Josh is a firefighter, and Kristen is a person who makes custom pet things like beds and stairs and things for your pet. And so they end up working together because Josh is doing some carpentry work for her. Kristen has a fiance. Josh immediately is attracted to her, but she's taken, or is she? And so thus begins their courtship. And that really is only part of the story. There is a lot that happens in the story, and it is not fun stuff. There is a lot of like medical trauma in this book. And there's stuff about infertility. There is stuff about there is like really awful stuff that happens, and I don't want to go into it because it would be spoiler territory, but it's very traumatic. This is a very traumatic book. This is not a fun and fluffy and light romance. It is a romance, but it is not fluffy by any means. So yeah, it was fine while I was reading it, and Abby Jimenez is a great romance author, but this is not my favorite by her. I like her more recent stuff a lot better. So that one's that. Then I finished The Best American Science and Nature Writing from 2023, which was edited by Carl Zimmer. I always read these. I love them. This one I happen to get on ebook. I usually collect them in print, but I just happened to pick this one up for a good deal. And I read it while I was on vacation, and it was nice to intersperse these essays, science essays, in between the lighter reading that I was doing. Some essays that stood out to me. There was one by Sabrina Imbler, who is an author that I will be reading next month for the Book Naturalist Book Club, and I very much enjoyed her science essay in this collection. There was another one, an essay about Alzheimer's and how there's this village in France that is providing a community for people with Alzheimer's and their families that works differently than the way a lot of medical treatment does for Alzheimer's, and that was really interesting. There was an essay about the impacts of agricultural work in El Salvador and high rates of kidney disease, and how this very clear connection between the agricultural work that people are doing and this disease. And she followed I can't remember if it's a male or female author actually, but the author follows like several families through how this is impacting them. It was a really compelling and brutally honest essay. So I thought that was really good. So, I just really love these collections. It's always interesting information to learn, and because they're in essay form, you can like dip in and out. So yeah, those are always a good time for me, and the 2023 collection was no different. I then finished Random in Death by J.D. Robb. This is book number 58 in the Eve Dallas series. And in this installment, which is the most recent one that was published, Eve is investigating these murders that are taking place. Somebody is randomly targeting teenage girls in public places and killing them. by injecting them with something. And I'm not going to go into the details because that's part of the fun of figuring it out. But it was a wild ride. And a lot of the times, like with these mysteries, the mystery is the secondary piece of the enjoyment for me because I really love the characters in this long-running series and I really like to see what they're getting up to. And so it's just like revisiting old friends when I read them. But I thought that this mystery was really, really interesting and different. And the person who was perpetrating these crimes was a piece of work. So yeah, it was pretty crazy. So yeah, that was a great one. I really enjoyed it. Again, perfect read for vacation. Like these were, I did excellently picking escapist reading for my vacation and giving my brain a break, which is really what I needed during my vacation. But then I came back from vacation, and the things that I have read since vacation have been much more serious. So let's get into those. The first thing I completed after vacation was The History of Bees by Maja Lunde, which is translated from the Norwegian by, oh, goodness gracious, I can't remember, and it doesn't say right here. It is Diane Oatley, I think, is the translator of these. So this is book 1 in the Climate Quartet by this author. I've since read book 2 in this, which I've talked about recently because I read it for Springathon. So this is the first one, and this book is 3 storylines. There's a historical storyline following a person in the 1800s, a man who is investigating bees and their natural history and doing observations and like trying to figure out a better way of building beehives so that scientists or observers can watch the bees and see what they're getting up to. And it's all part of like the whole Darwin era of science exploration, particularly by white males. And that's a big part of the story, that this is a white dude doing this. I mean, that's part of the story. I'm not just saying that to be, I'm not trying to get a rise out of anyone. That's part that what's important about the storyline. And then the second storyline is sort of present day, a little bit earlier than now, but modern times, following a farmer in the Midwest in the United States who has a bee farm and is struggling to like maintain the solvency of his farm with new diseases that are impacting bees, and also with sort of industrialization of bee farming. And he's trying to stay very local and not industrialized. So that's an interesting storyline. And then the third storyline is in the future. We're in China with the main character who is a person who has to go up into the trees and pollinate by hand the flowers because the bees have died off because of climate change and other things. Human use of the earth, and so where we're at in the world is there is no natural pollination happening, and all pollination in order to grow food has to happen by hand. And each one of these storylines is not only talking about pollination and the importance of pollination to like food and how we do things as human, but each is also exploring the relationship between parents and children in very interesting ways. It's exploring the gender roles in those areas of parenting. It's exploring gender roles in terms of who does what for jobs in a relationship. And it does this throughout each of the storylines. I thought this was really well done. It was very slow to start. The first, I would say 75 pages or so, I was unsure about it, but then I got hooked in. I became very invested in the characters. I will say one of the reasons I think, it took me longer, first of all, there's 3 storylines, which tends to be harder to like sort of latch onto when there's that many storylines going on. But it also was difficult because none of the characters are particularly likable. They're all kind of jerks in their own way. And I think Maja Lunde, does a great job of building characters that are very human in their perspectives and very human in their actions, in that they are not perfect people. They do things that you may or may not agree with, and they don't always act in a way that you think they ought to. And they're not always nice, and they're not always kind. So I think that is very realistic. So yeah, it's also the subject matter is quite depressing because climate change and the impacts of that on pollination. and the impacts of like diseases because of how humans use resources, the diseases that get spread around now. It's very, very depressing and discouraging. So, just take that on board before you pick up the Climate Quartet. I mean, if you're reading climate fiction, it's going to be a dark-edged tale, right? But very good writing and very interesting story to be told here. So I like that one. And then I buddy read Bel Canto with Sandy from Misreads a Lot. And this was a book off my ancient TBR. So I was glad to finally get to this one. And so this is a story about a party is happening in a South American country where a famous opera singer has been brought to perform at this party. Like some South American government, like the head of the government is hosting this party for a Japanese businessman to try to encourage this Japanese business to invest in this country, to like build a business in this country. So as this party is happening, some ostensibly quote unquote terrorists come in and take the party over and take all of these people hostage. And in the next day or so, they send all of the women out of the building. They send them all out and they keep the men hostage and also the opera singer. And so then becomes a story of what happens to this group of people who are being held hostage, how the interactions go between them and the supposed terrorists, the people who are holding them hostage. And it's interesting because all of the characters, as you explore the characters and the characters start to interact with each other, it's very interesting in the beginning. It's also very absurd, some of the things that happen. Like it's just like shining a light on the absurdity of what would happen if you were placed in this situation and how you might act. And of course, all of the party attendees, all of these men, and this plus this one opera singer, they're all from different countries and different backgrounds. And so they all have very different ways of like being in the world and how they converse, how they act in situations. Like they all have, there's Japanese people, there's German people, there's people from the South American country, there's European people, there's Americans. So there's people from like all walks of life there. And then how do they all interact? So all of that was very interesting. And then as the book goes on, about halfway through, Sandy and I both started to feel like, okay, but now what are we going to do here? What's happening? Like it just seemed to drag on in the middle. And then when you're like, okay, how is this going to resolve itself? Because this is not going to end well. Like, and yet everybody in this situation somehow has deluded themselves into thinking that it can end well. And obviously it can't end well. Like obviously this is not going to end well. And then you get to the ending, and I have to say, the ending ruined this book for me. Like I was enjoying this book, and then I thought it dragged a little bit in the middle, but I was still on board for it. And then there's an epilogue at the end of this. I think it's called an epilogue. First of all, I thought the ending was overly dramatic for where the book had been previously. And then you get this short epilogue at the end, and the epilogue is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it made me so angry when I read it that I'm like, ugh, I was so disgusted with the epilogue. So yeah, I cannot recommend this book because the way that it ends is it's so ridiculous. I just don't understand why you would put that epilogue on the end of this book. This otherwise very interesting book. I mean, I didn't fully love all of it, but I think it was very interesting. And I thought that the way that she explored character in this book was quite interesting. And the way that she explores music and what music means to people, particularly when you're in a very difficult situation, that was interesting. Ending, crap. That might be a controversial opinion, but I can't help it. It's my opinion. Okay, then the next thing I finished was The New Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. This is nonfiction. I buddy read it with Britta. And we had read his book, The Silk Roads, several months ago. Really liked that book, all about how the history of how things have come from the East to the West versus the way us in Western countries normally think about history as West to East. And I thought that was a really good exploration of a lot of history that I didn't know very much about. And so this book, The New Silk Roads, takes where he left off at the end, which was like basically the end of the 1990s, and sort of explains what's happened since then. But the problem is the book was published in 2018. So he finished writing it right around 2016. And so it feels while interesting, it feels very intermediate. It feels like we don't know the end of the story yet. It feels like he was writing it before things were resolved, because he published this book, right? We've got the Trump presidency, we've got a pandemic, we've got the war in Afghanistan, like all of these things have happened since then. And it just feels like while you're reading, it's information about like China and the whole Belt and Road initiative, and how countries in the East are like doing things differently than particularly the United States. But it feels very unfinished. It feels like it's an intermediate book. It is very interesting and very informative. It felt like it needed to cook a little while longer, I think is how I would put it. And I also was a little bit irritated at this like super huge focus on the United States in every aspect. It's like, I understand, I mean, the United States is the elephant in the room globally, but like I wanted to know more about the other countries. And we'd get little tidbits and tantalizing pieces, and then it would be like, okay, but then the US is doing all of this over here. And it's like, yeah, I know we're doing all this crap over here, but I want more about what the other countries are doing. So it was good, but it wasn't as good. I didn't have as good of an experience with it as I had with his previous book. And I'm hoping that he will write another one, because he's still only middle-aged. So I think he has more books left in him. So hopefully we'll get a newer New Silk Roads from him. And then I finished another Abby Jimenez. This is Just for the Summer. This is her most recent romance. And I love this book. I thought this was fantastic. The characters in here are so good. This is a romance, but it is also more than a romance. Like, there is not a lot of sex in this book. So if you are the kind of person that avoids romance books because you don't want to read a lot of sex scenes, like, this is a book for you. This is more about relationships in general. It's about how people hurt each other and how you deal with that. Both of the main characters, so the main characters are Emma and Justin. Emma and Justin both think that they are cursed in relationships, because every time they break up with somebody in a romantic relationship, they break up, the next person their ex dates is their soulmate, true love, whatever. And so all of their exes keep getting married and getting their happily ever afters, but not Justin and Emma. They're just the ones destined to be always broken up with. And so they decide to date each other in order to break the curse. Because if they date each other, then they'll each theoretically find their true love in the next go around of romance. But of course, when they start dating each other, they start to fall for each other. But they both have a lot of issues to deal with. Emma has a very toxic mother that she has to deal with. And Justin has to deal with, the fact that he is becoming the guardian to his 3 siblings, his much younger siblings. And so these two have a lot of issues in their own lives. And the thing that I really enjoyed about this was they're dealing with that. They're not just putting the romance at the forefront and only thinking about the romance. They know, they're realistic, they're adults. They know they have shit to deal with, and they deal with it. And it's so refreshing to read a romance book where the adults actually act like adults. Like, they address their problems, they talk about their problems, they face their problems, and realize that you can't always have what you want the minute you want it. Sometimes you have to wait. Fantastic, just so good. And the friend groups and the dialogue, like all the things that I love about contemporary romance are here. But also this bit of like people acting like real adult humans, which I very much enjoy. And I buddy read this with my romance buddy readers, Doris and Katie, and we all really had a good time with that one. And then last but not least, I finished my reread of The Two Towers by JRR Tolkien. I was buddy reading this with Kim from Middle of the Book March and Doris. We've been rereading the Lord of the Rings series this year, and I mean, this is a 5-star read for me. It doesn't matter how many times I read it. I love it. This book is funny because the parts where, so you get halfway into the book and then you're basically in the Frodo and Sam walk through Mordor part of the whole story, and it can be repetitive, and Frodo and Sam, and it just can be like, ugh, like that's not my favorite part. But then something will happen and you'll be like, oh, I love that scene so much. Like the characters, the way that they react to the adversity that they face, the way they are constantly stepping up, like not just Sam and Frodo, but you know, all of the characters from the Fellowship, like the way that they just constantly rise above the expectations, the way that they are just thoroughly good. It's just so nice, and it's so affirming and heartwarming. And even though bad things happen, of course I know how it's going to end because I've read it so many times, but like the true goodness of these characters always shines forth. And it's just nice to read a story where like people are for the most part just trying to be the best that they can be. They're just trying to do the best that they can do most of the time. And sometimes they fail, but most of the time they don't. So yeah. And all like Gandalf and Shadowfax and Aragorn, like just love these characters. I mean, honestly, I love these characters. This has always been my the book that I can fall into and feel like I'm in that place more than any other book. And it doesn't seem to matter how many times I reread it. I still get that feeling of like, I am now in Middle Earth. And it's like, how can this book keep doing that after this many years? When I first read it, I was 9 years old, 9 or 10 years old. I read them all over the course of a Christmas break because I received the box set for a Christmas present. And I was transported to Middle Earth, and it still happens to me every single time I read these. So, I mean, this is books that stand the test of time for sure. I love them so much. So that was it. That is all the books I read, all 10 of them that I read for April that I had not yet talked about or that I can talk about. It was a great reading month filled with lots of escapist reading and then some serious stuff there at the end. I really feel like it was a great reading month. I hope you had a great reading month in April. I hope you've read some great books since then. I hope you're all doing well and finding some great books to read, and I will talk to you later.